Hello, welcome to Honors Biology Cell Reproduction number 2 lecture video. We're going to begin this one by talking about the first type of cell division. There's two types. There's asexual reproduction and there's sexual reproduction. We are going to be focusing on asexual reproduction today on this lecture. First off, asexual reproduction means not sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction is the opposite. It would be arrows, two parents making one baby, opposite of this. This is one parent cell producing two new offsprings that are genetically identical to the parent. So the parent cell, the daughter cells. The parent cell and the daughter cells, they are all genetically identical. When would you do asexual? You do it all the time. You do asexual reproduction when you're producing, for example, you cut your skin, you need to heal the wound, you are making new cells that are genetically identical to the previous cells. Okay. If they are not genetically identical, it means something changed and something went wrong, and that could be a big problem. Okay. So let's begin. Asexual reproduction. Now, asexual reproduction in bacteria or prokaryotes is called binary fission. Binary, like a bicycle, breaks into two. Starts as one and it breaks into two new cells. Fission means breaking apart. So it starts as one and it gets broken apart into two. So you start out as basically a prokaryote, and they have this DNA would be circular DNA, would form a circular, but it looks all folded over. And sometimes they have another piece of DNA called a plasmid, which is also circular DNA. What happens is each DNA starts making a copy of itself. You can see here, it looks like there's two, and there's another copy of itself. It keeps copying itself. Eventually, they split apart from each other, just like this. Eventually, it starts pinching in. This is a cell wall that it starts, or the beginnings of what will be a cell wall in this prokaryote, and it eventually pinches off completely. This is binary fission. These two cells are genetically identical to the parent cell. Okay, so this is asexual reproduction specifically in prokaryotes or bacteria. The cell cycle. So think of this as the life cycle of a cell. Like, what's a cell doing in its life? Okay. So when does it get born? Well, it gets born when a cell is produced. So we're going to start here. A cell is born, and here's two new cells. So one cell made two new cells. All right. So we have two new cells here. The cells go through this phase they go through these parts of the cell cycle. They go through G1, they go through S, and they go through in G2 in that order. After they get through them, they go through this process called mitosis, which we're going to cover in more detail later in this lecture. And mitosis is the division of the nucleus. So they divide the nucleus. Cytokinesis is it divides the cytoplasm and then splits into two new cells. All right. So G1, the G1 growth, G1 is when the cell is growing and getting ready to do a lot of the stuff it needs to do later, like divide. All right. So it tells you here, cellular contents, excluding the chromosomes, are duplicated. Things get copied. Organelles get copied in G1. Gets to the S part. And the S part, S stands for synthesis, which means it's making a copy of its DNA. So if you look here, they look like individual little chromatids. Well, each chromatid is completely different. There's a blue one and a red one. Well, the blue one and the red one both copy their chromatid and make their sister chromatid, and now they are full-on chromosomes. Okay, so that happens during the S part of the cell cycle. Then the cell goes through what's called G2. What happens in G2? It continues growing, it continues duplicating things like organelles and things that it might need. It finishes getting ready, and it pretty much is looking at seeing if everything's good to go for actual cell division. So in G2, it's preparing for cell division, and cell division happens in mitosis and cytokinesis. Okay, mitosis is the division of the nucleus, that's the chromosomes, and the division of the cytoplasm. Sometimes cells leave the cell cycle. We're going to talk about that next. They go into what's called the G0 or the cell or cycle arrest phase. That's coming up next. Okay, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Here we go. Interphase, let's go back here. Interphase is a time period. It's the time between cell divisions. So let's go back. G1, S, and G2, this is the time period between cell divisions. So G1, S, and G2 are known collectively as interphase. See how it's labeled right here? The G1, S, and G2 are interphase. So I would like to say interphase is kind of like when the cell is being normal and doing its own thing and doing what the cell needs to do for you. Okay? Most of a cell's life is an interphase, and this is what a cell looks like in interphase, basically. All right. It's not dividing an interphase. It's getting ready to divide, but it is not dividing an interphase. All right. So this is that G0. Sometimes I told you cells go into a phase that's outside of the cell cycle. Well, that's this right here, the G0. It usually happens, it leaves the cell cycle in the G1 phase. Why would a cell go to the G0 or part of the cell cycle? Well, not all cells want to divide. They, for example, mature nerve cells and muscle cells, if you've damaged them, they need to get repaired. They need, for example, muscle cells. A lot of times if you tear up certain muscle, you got to go have it sewed back together because it will not reconnect on its own. That's because the cells cannot, they do not divide. They don't get all the way through the G1, S, and G2 to divide through the mitosis and cytokinesis. So certain cells leave the cell cycle, go to the G0 phase, and that is a cell arrest cycle outside of the typical cell cycle. And in this place, it is not copying its DNA, it's not preparing for division, and it's not going to divide, basically. Okay, so cells do that commonly. They exit the cell cycle, usually from G1. These are nerve cells and muscle cells that you will not be able to duplicate later on. And this is another picture showing you what goes on. So here's interphase, G1, S, and G2, pretty much being normal and not dividing, getting ready to divide, but not dividing. And then cell division is mitosis and cytokinesis. It breaks into two new cells. Sometimes the cells leave the cell cycle and go to the G0 phase, the cell arrest cycle. And this is, sometimes it can come back in, sometimes it's temporary, but a lot of times with certain cells, it is permanent. And they, for example, nerve cells or neurons cannot copy themselves, which is why people, when they damage their spinal cord, they become paralyzed for life in most cases. Mitosis, this is asexual reproduction in you and me, in eukaryotes. What do we do when we do asexual reproduction? Well, we do mitosis, all right? We divide the contents of our nucleus. We split off into two new cells. It is 4 phases or 4 stages: prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. Interphase is the cell being normal. This is not mitosis. Okay, this is G1, S, and G2. This is not mitosis. It is asexual reproduction because you end up with 2 cells that are genetic duplicates of each other. They're identical to each other. Also, why do cells do this? I mentioned it earlier in an earlier lecture, to grow, repair, and replace damaged cells. That's why your cells do mitosis. They do it for those purposes. And what does mitosis make at the end? It makes diploid cells. So if you start with 1, 2, 3, 4 chromosomes, it ends with 1, 2, 3, 4 chromosomes. You start with 4, you end with 4. You start diploid, you end diploid. Okay? This is how you make more body cells, and a fancy word for body cells is somatic cells. So what does mitosis do for you and me? It makes genetic duplicates of the original parent cell, which are diploid, and this is what we do to make more body cells, somatic cells. Okay? The opposite of mitosis is meiosis. Meiosis does not make diploid cells. It makes sex cells, which are haploid. So mitosis makes diploid, meaning a full set of chromosomes, and it makes body cells. Okay? And these are another picture that you have in your notes showing you prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. And this, once again, is asexual reproduction in eukaryotes like you and me. All right, we're going to stop there.